The crash echoed through the crypt of the Basilica of Notre-Dame de Cléry like thunder in a summer storm. It was August 30th, 1483, 3 days after the king's death, when the oak-wood coffin splintered from within, releasing a stench that made the guards stumble toward the damp walls, covering their noses and mouths with cloths soaked in involuntary tears. The swollen body of Louis XIII, the Spider King, had turned into a bomb of putrid flesh, gases and fluids that sprayed through the cracked wood, as if death itself rejected the man who had defied God, the nobility and fate throughout his 22-year reign. Pierre de Rohan, Grand Admiral of France, was present at that dreadful moment. His fingers trembled when, weeks later, he wrote in a secret letter to the Duke of Brittany, "Your Majesty has never seen anything so horrendous. The king's body, disintegrated as though 1,000 demons fought to escape their prison of flesh. The smell. God forgive me, but I believe even the stones of the church wept that day." The letter, found in Breton archives centuries later, revealed not only the physical horror of the scene, but also the certainty that something supernatural had occurred to the man who had transformed France into a web of fear, intrigue, and absolute power. 47 years earlier, in 1423, when Louis was born at Bourges Castle, no one could have imagined that the frail, piercing-eyed infant would become the architect of one of the most brutal transformations in French history. His father, Charles VII, was still fighting the English in a war that seemed endless, while Joan of Arc had already burned at the stake in Rouen 2 years earlier. France was a fragmented kingdom where powerful dukes ruled their territories. Like independent kings, and royal authority extended little beyond the walls of a few loyal cities. But Louis grew up watching, always watching. By the age of 10, his tutors noted something unsettling in the boy, who spent hours in silence, studying maps and noble genealogies with the intensity of a hunter analyzing the tracks of his prey. "The young Dauphin has eyes that see beyond what he should," wrote his confessor, Father William, in his personal diary. "There are moments when his expression gives me chills, as if he knows secrets that not even God should share with a child." At 15, when he assumed governance of the Dauphiné, Louis already displayed the cold calculation that would mark his entire existence. His first decree was to have 3 local nobles hanged for questioning his authority, turning the execution into a public spectacle. He watched from the window of his castle, drinking wine as the bodies swayed in the cold alpine wind. Chroniclers of the time recorded that he showed no emotion. He merely jotted something down in a small black leather notebook he always carried. That notebook became legendary among his contemporaries. Foreign diplomats reported in their official correspondence that the young Dauphin meticulously recorded the weaknesses, fears, vices, and secrets of every nobleman, merchant, or clergyman with whom he interacted. "He collects souls as others collect coins," wrote the Milanese ambassador Francesco Sforza to the Duke of Milan. "Every conversation, every gesture, every tremor of voice is catalogued in that cursed book. They say he knows the sins of half a kingdom." His relationship with his father, Charles VII, deteriorated quickly once Louis began to conspire openly against the crown. In 1440, at just 17, he joined the revolt known as the Praguerie, a coalition of discontented nobles seeking to curb royal power. The rebellion failed miserably, but Charles VII, showing mercy his son would never know, pardoned the traitor. Louis received the forgiveness with a cold smile that froze the blood of everyone at court. "Your Majesty is far too generous," he said, bowing in a reverence that seemed more a promise of future vengeance than gratitude. In the following years, father and son waged an unrelenting psychological war. Louis ruled the Dauphiné like an independent realm, openly defying royal orders and forging secret alliances with foreign powers. His tactics were as subtle as they were cruel. He bribed servants to spy on correspondents, blackmailed nobles with their most intimate secrets, and manipulated family rivalries to weaken potential opponents. In 1446, when Charles VII finally lost patience and marched against his rebellious son, Louis had already fled to the court of Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy. The Burgundian exile lasted 5 years and shaped Louis's character irrevocably. At Philip's court, the most sophisticated in Europe, he learned that true power did not lie in brute force, but in the subtle manipulation of human passions. He watched how the Duke controlled his vassals through a lethal combination of calculated generosity and discreet terror. Well-measured fear is more effective than 1,000 swords, he noted in his notebook on December 1449. A man who fears for his children's lives is more obedient than an army of mercenaries. During those years in exile, Louis also developed an obsession with astrology and occult practices that would later define his reign. He regularly visited an alchemist named Cornelius van Houten, a cadaverous man of Dutch origin who claimed he could foresee the future through a combination of cards, crystals, and the entrails of sacrificed animals. The sessions always took place at midnight in an abandoned tower on the outskirts of Genappe, where Louis spent hours in a trance, whispering questions about his destiny while the alchemist manipulated macabre symbols by candlelight. Jacques de Lalaing, a Burgundian knight who occasionally accompanied these sessions, described in his memoirs the transformation that overtook the young Dauphin during these rituals. His face would take on a deathly pallor, as if all life had been drained from his veins. His eyes became two black embers that seemed to see through dimensions. At certain moments, I swore his voice was no longer human, but something guttural and ancient emerging from the depths of his throat. Cornelius smiled during these transformations, as though witnessing the birth of something both terrible and magnificent. In July 1461, Charles VII died suddenly after a meal, the victim of an infection the physicians could not explain. Some whispered of poison, others of a curse, but Louis received the news of his father's death with a serenity that shocked even his Burgundian allies. "The king is dead. Long live the king," he murmured, then locked himself in his chambers. For 3 days, no one heard a single word from him during that time. When he finally emerged, it was as though a different man had been born in that dark room. His journey back to France was a triumphal procession that immediately revealed the kind of monarch Louis intended to be. In every city, every castle, every monastery where he stopped, he already possessed detailed information about the local inhabitants, how many children each noble had, the debts of the merchants, the secret sins of the clergy. His first stop was in Reims, where he was to be crowned. But even before the ceremony, he ordered the arrest of 3 barons who had conspired against him during his exile. The executions took place in the early hours before the coronation, and the bodies hung from the city walls throughout the ceremony, swaying gently in the morning breeze while the archbishop placed the crown on the new king's head. Louis XV's first official act as King of France was to dismiss almost all of his father's counselors and replace them with men of humble origin but absolute devotion to himself. Olivier le Daim, a Flemish barber, Tristan le Hermite, a nameless soldier who would become his personal executioner, Jean Balou, an ambitious priest from a peasant family. These men formed the core of a new kind of government, based not on feudal tradition, but on personal loyalty to the monarch. "The king surrounds himself with wolves disguised as lambs," wrote chronicler Philippe de Comines, who would later become one of Louis's chief advisors. "Each carries the marks of hunger and cruelty of those who had nothing and now have everything to lose." The transformation of France under Louis XV was simultaneously fascinating and terrifying. He established a network of espionage that stretched across the kingdom and beyond its borders, with informants in every tavern, every monastery, every market fair. His flies as his spies were known, reported not only political conspiracies, but also private conversations, extramarital affairs, financial troubles, and even the dreams and nightmares of French citizens. In 1465, when he faced the revolt known as the League of the Public Weal, led by the Duke of Burgundy and other great feudal lords, Louis already knew every move of the rebels before they themselves made their decisions. The Battle of Montlhéry in July 1465 revealed not only Louis's military prowess, but also his growing obsession with macabre symbols and superstitious practices. On the eve of the battle, he spent the entire night in an abandoned church, praying before a collection of relics he had acquired from across Europe. Fragments of saints' bones, teeth of martyrs, pieces of wood purportedly taken from Christ's cross. But his prayers were not directed to traditional Christian saints. According to his private chaplain, Father Anthony, Louis invoked entities whose names made the cleric tremble. He whispered words in languages I had never heard, tongues older than Latin itself. His lips moved at impossible speed, as if reciting incantations, and the air around the altar grew so cold that I could see my breath even though it was midsummer. The victory at Montlhéry was achieved through a combination of innovative military tactics and psychological terror that paralyzed his enemies. During the battle, Louis ordered his soldiers to carry banners decorated with symbols that no chronicler could adequately describe, only that whoever looked directly at those images felt inexplicable nausea and a primitive fear that corroded even the bravest knight's courage. The Duke of Burgundy, Charles the Bold, would later describe that battle as a confrontation with forces not of this world. After the victory, Louis's cruelty reached levels that shocked even the violent standards of the time. Captured, noble prisoners were not only executed, but subjected to tortures, combining traditional physical torment with rituals that seemed inspired by ancient pagan practices. The Count of Charolais was found dead in his cell, with his body covered in symbols carved into his skin, symbols the executioners themselves swore they had not created. "The king possesses knowledge no Christian should have," wrote an anonymous monk in a letter intercepted by the Royal Espionage Network. "There is something inside him that is not human, something that feeds on the pain and fear of others." In the following years, Louis consolidated his power through a policy of systematic terror that turned France into a kingdom of ghosts. Any noble showing independent ambitions disappeared mysteriously, their properties confiscated, their families scattered. Entire towns that resisted royal authority awoke to emptiness, signs of struggle but no bodies, as though the inhabitants had simply evaporated during the night. In 1468, when he captured Charles the Bold in Péronne, Louis was not content with traditional political humiliation. He forced the Burgundian duke to sign a treaty written in ink, rumored to be made from human blood, and during the negotiations, kept the prisoner in a cell with constant whispers in unknown tongues, voices that seemed to emerge from the prison's very stones. Philippe de Comines, who during these years became the king's closest counselor, left detailed records of Louis XVIII's physical and mental decline throughout the 1470s. "His Majesty aged unnaturally," he wrote. "In a matter of months, his hair turned from brown to pure white, his skin acquired a cadaverous pallor, and his eyes, God forgive me, but his eyes seemed to have seen things no mortal should see. He constantly spoke with invisible interlocutors, whispering answers to questions no one else could hear. During council meetings, his hands trembled uncontrollably, as if he were always cold, even on the hottest summer days." Louis's obsession with death intensified dramatically after a hunting accident in 1473, when his horse stumbled and sent him crashing into a tree, so violently that he remained unconscious for 3 days. When he awoke, his first attendants reported that he screamed for hours in a voice that did not seem his own, alternating between French and dialects no one could identify. Father Anthony, called to administer last rites, recorded in his journal, "The king woke speaking of things he saw during his unconsciousness. He described a realm of shadows, ruled by creatures he called the true lords of the earth. He said they had shown him France's future and that he would have much work to do before joining them definitively." From that moment, Louis Sacre began to build a network of secret chapels and altars throughout the kingdom, places where he practiced rituals, blending Christian elements with much older, darker traditions. The most famous of these sites was an artificial crypt built beneath the Château de Plessis-les-Tours, his favorite residence, where he spent entire nights in meditations that his guards described as conversations with the dead. Jean de Daillon, one of his most loyal knights, wrote in his memoirs, "The voices emanating from that crypt during His Majesty's sessions were so numerous and distinct, they seemed echoes of an infernal banquet. Some spoke in archaic French, others in tongues predating Latin itself. And at the center of that cacophony, the king's voice rose like that of a master of ceremonies orchestrating a ritual whose purpose I prefer not to imagine." During the final 10 years of his reign, Louis XV became an almost ghostly figure, rarely seen in public, ruling through a combination of written decrees and supernatural manifestations that terrified even his closest advisors. Foreign ambassadors reported in their official dispatches that audiences with the French king always took place in dimly lit chambers, where Louis appeared as a hooded shadow whose eyes glowed with a light neither natural nor human. "The King of France no longer seems to belong to the realm of the living," wrote the Venetian ambassador Marco Bembo to the Doge. "His presence brings a cold that penetrates to the bone, and his voice echoes as though coming from far away, from a place beyond life and death." Louis's paranoia reached pathological levels in the 1480s. He had a series of secret passages and deadly traps installed in the Château de Plessis-les-Tours, transforming his own residence into an impregnable fortress where every visitor was thoroughly searched by guards ordered to kill anyone making a suspicious move. His meals were prepared by cooks who swore absolute loyalty over sacred relics, and each dish was tested by 3 tasters before reaching the royal table. Even so, Louis rarely ate more than a few bites of any meal, preferring to sustain himself on a strange diet primarily of wine, diluted with holy water, and pieces of bread. He blessed himself through whispered prayers. His physical decline accelerated drastically after 1481. Olivier le Daim, his barber and confidant, left a secret account of the king's final years that was discovered only in the 17th century, hidden in a wall of the Château de Plessis. His Majesty wasted away, as though an invisible force drained his vital essence. His skin became translucent like ancient parchment, revealing dark veins that pulsed to a rhythm different from a normal human heart. His hair fell out in entire clumps, leaving his scalp covered in wounds that never fully healed. And the smell. God forgive me, but His Majesty exuded an odor of decomposition, even while alive, as if something within him had already begun to rot. The last weeks of Louis XV's life were marked by phenomena that defied any rational explanation. Servants reported that his shadow moved independently of his body, casting shapes on the walls that did not correspond to his human silhouette. At night, animalistic screams echoed throughout the castle, screams that seemed to come from the royal apartments yet were impossible to pinpoint. Tristan l'Hermite, his personal executioner, found the king wandering the corridors in the dead of night several times, walking with his eyes closed but navigating obstacles perfectly, as though guided by an external force. On August 25, 1483, Louis XV was found in his chamber in a condition his physicians could not fully comprehend. He was conscious, but his body appeared rigid in a fetal position, muscles contracted so severely that it was impossible to straighten him. His eyes remained open, but his pupils had dilated so much the irises were almost invisible. For 3 days, he remained in that state, constantly whispering words that alternated between Christian prayers and invocations in unknown tongues. Father Anthony, who stayed by his side administering last rites, recorded that the words coming from His Majesty's lips seemed to burn the air around him, creating visible waves of heat even in the cold atmosphere of the royal chamber. In the early hours of August 30th, when he finally expired, witnesses reported that the moment of death was accompanied by phenomena that left a profound mark on all present. Jean Balou, his ecclesiastical advisor, wrote in a secret letter to Pope Sixtus IV, when the king's final breath departed his lips, the candles in the chamber went out simultaneously, without any wind, plunging the room into absolute darkness. In that moment of darkness, everyone present heard a laughter that did not come from the dead man's throat, but seemed to emerge from the very stones of the castle. When we managed to relight the torches, His Majesty's body had assumed an expression of malevolent triumph that persisted even after death, as if he had finally found what he had sought all his life. What happened in the 3 days that followed remains one of the most disturbing mysteries in French history. The body was prepared for the funeral according to traditional rites, but those responsible for the embalming reported inexplicable difficulties. Master Peter, the royal embalmer, confided to his assistant that the body resisted the procedures as if it still possessed life of its own. The entrails refused to be removed, clinging to the organs with supernatural force. The blood that should have coagulated continued to flow as if the heart still beat. And throughout the entire process, I swear I heard whispers coming from within the corpse, multiple voices seeming to argue among themselves in a language predating any known tongue. The coffin was sealed on the afternoon of September 2nd and transported to the Basilica of Notre-Dame de Cléry, where Louis had expressed his wish to be buried. During the procession, several witnesses reported that the funeral cortege was accompanied by inexplicable atmospheric phenomena. Clouds formed instantly above the procession, casting a constant shadow even when the sun shone brightly in the surrounding countryside. Birds fell dead from the sky as they flew over the coffin, and horses refused to approach the funeral carriage, neighing in terror despite being battle-hardened animals. The explosion of the coffin 3 days after the funeral immediately became the subject of speculation, ranging from medical explanations about decomposition gases to supernatural theories of curses and demonic possession. But official records were carefully censored, and most witnesses were expressly ordered never to discuss what had occurred. Young Charles VIII, Louis's son and successor, had a new solid stone tomb constructed to contain his father's remains, and established a group of monks to maintain perpetual vigils over the sepulchre, praying continuously to keep in peace what must remain at rest. Over the following centuries, Louis XV's tomb became the focus of secret pilgrimages by occultists and students of esoteric practices who believed the Spider King had discovered secrets about the nature of death and power that transcended the limits of normal human existence. Records of the French Inquisition document at least 12 cases of people found dead near the tomb between 1485 and 1520, always under the same circumstances. Bodies discovered in a fetal position, expressions of absolute terror frozen on their faces, and self-inflicted wounds, suggesting they had tried to gouge out their own eyes before dying. In 1562, during the Wars of Religion, Huguenot soldiers desecrated Louis XVIII's tomb in an attempt to find royal treasures. Military records describe that the men who opened the sarcophagus emerged screaming incoherently about eyes glowing in the darkness and voices offering forbidden knowledge. 3 of the 5 soldiers involved in the profanation went completely mad and had to be confined in monasteries, where they spent the rest of their lives obsessively repeating prayers in tongues none of the monks could identify. Louis XV's legacy extends far beyond his political achievements and France's territorial unification. He represents a particular kind of power that transcends traditional categories of tyranny or political genius, venturing into realms that defy rational understanding of human ambition's limits. His methods of government set precedents that would influence the development of European absolutism, but they also left a darker mark on the French collective psyche, the notion that true power demands pacts beyond conventional earthly alliances. Legends about Louis XVI evolved over the centuries, transforming him into a mythical figure embodying both the fascination and horror mortals feel when faced with those who apparently transcend the constraints of human condition. His story became a mirror in which each generation sees its fears about the price of absolute power and the consequences of defying the natural laws governing existence. Surviving documents from Louis XV's secret archives suggest he possessed an understanding of human nature far beyond conventional political knowledge. His personal notes, discovered only in the 19th century in a hidden chamber of the Château de Plessis, reveal a man obsessed not only with controlling the present, but with manipulating reality's very fabric through practices combining politics, psychology, and elements that can only be described as practical magic. In one such note, dated December 1478, Louis wrote, "True power does not lie in the ability to compel men to obey, but in the skill to make them desire to obey, even when they know that obedience will destroy them. Fear is only the first step. Perverse love is the ultimate goal. When a subject kisses the hand that strangles him, then the king has touched the essence of what governs the universe." These words, written in handwriting that grew increasingly erratic over the years, suggest a mind that had penetrated psychological territories most mortals prefer to avoid. Louis XV's influence on his successors was profound and lasting, but also burdened by a curse that seemed to afflict the Valois dynasty for generations. Charles VIII, his son, developed a paranoia echoing his father's, but lacking the cruel intelligence to channel it constructively. Louis XV and Francis I, who followed, reported recurring nightmares in which Louis XV's ghost appeared, offering advice on consolidating power through methods they dared not implement, even in their most desperate moments. Louis XV's transformation of France established the model for the modern centralized state, but also introduced a dark dimension into European political culture that persisted for centuries. The notion that an effective ruler must transcend conventional moral considerations, that raison d'etat justifies any means, that true power demands alliances with forces beyond traditional human morality. These ideas can all be traced back to the Spider King's methods of governance. When we contemplate the corpse that exploded in Louis XV's coffin, we confront not only a bizarre medical phenomenon or macabre historical curiosity, but a brutal metaphor for the self-destructive nature of absolute power and the physical and spiritual consequences of a life devoted to the relentless manipulation of human nature. The body that refused to accept peaceful death, that continued to emit terror even after its final breath, represents the impossibility of containing indefinitely. The force is unleashed when a mortal dares to defy the limits imposed by the human condition. Louis XV's story teaches that there are boundaries that should not be crossed, knowledge that should not be pursued, alliances that should not be formed. Yet it also confronts us with the disturbing truth that there will always be those willing to pay any price for absolute power, even when that price includes their very soul and eternal peace. The Spider King wove his web with threads of fear, ambition, and forbidden knowledge, creating a masterpiece of political control that continues to fascinate and horrify those who study the extremes to which human ambition can lead. Ultimately, Louis XV remains an eternal symbol of the terrible seduction of absolute power and the monstrous transformations that can occur when a mortal decides no price is too high to achieve his goals. His explosive corpse in the coffin stands as a visceral, indelible warning etched into history's stone. There are forces in human existence that, once unleashed, cannot be easily contained. And there are ambitions that consume not only those who harbor them, but even the remains they leave behind. Modern studies of cadaveric decomposition have tried to rationally explain Louis XV's coffin explosion, pointing to the abnormal buildup of gases resulting from accelerated putrefaction, influenced by factors such as temperature, humidity, and possible chemical substances present in the body due to period medical treatments. But these scientific explanations, while plausible, fail to account for the full range of phenomena reported by contemporary witnesses, nor do they explain why similar cases are exceedingly rare in documented history. The truth about Louis XVIII perhaps lies precisely at the intersection of the explainable and the inexplicable, between the political and the supernatural, between strategic genius and obsessive madness. He represents that particular kind of historical figure who transcends conventional categories of analysis, forcing us to acknowledge that aspects of human experience defy both rational understanding and simplified moral judgment. The Spider King wove his web with such mastery that even his death became part of his work, a final act of macabre theater that ensured his immortality not just in history books, but in humanity's collective memory as the extreme example of what can happen when human ambition refuses to recognize limits. His corpse that exploded in the coffin remains a visceral, indelible symbol that some prices, even when paid in life, continue to be demanded after death, and certain legacies refuse to rest peacefully in the dusty pages of the past.